Hi everybody. Based on the pre-lab quiz question from last week that was asking about your experience with Excel, it sounds like a lot of you don't have much experience with analyzing data in Microsoft Excel or making graphs or things like that. And this is a skill that you're going to need for your post-lab in week 5 as well as throughout a lot of the labs that we're going to do this semester. So I thought it would be helpful to make a quick video showing you how to make graphs in Excel. So you can do a lot of things in Excel. It's useful for a lot of calculations and data analysis and things. But for now, we're going to focus specifically on how to make the kinds of graphs that you'll need for your Week 5 lab. So if you already know how to make a graph in Excel, you may want to skip ahead to the last minute or two of this video where I'm going to have some hints that specifically relate to the Week 5 lab. I'm recording this video using Microsoft Office 2011 for Mac. So if you have a different version of Office, you should still have all the same options that I'm going to use, but they may not be in exactly the same places, so you might have to search around a little bit to find what you need, but it should all be there. So when you first open Excel, you should have a window that looks something like this. So the first thing we need to do if we're plotting data in Excel is to type in our data so we have something to plot. So I'm just going to pretend we did some imaginary experiment where we were plotting the temperature of something over time. So I'm going to make a column for our time data and a column for our temperature data. And this is just pretend numbers that I'm making up just so we have something to make a graph of. So this is how you want to enter your data. Put whatever you want to be in the x-axis along one column. And then start a second column for whatever data you want to be on the y-axis. So now that we have all of our data typed in, to actually make our graph, we're going to click on this little button that says Charts. If you have a different version of Excel, you may not have that button. You may need to go to Insert, Chart instead. But I have this button, so I'm going to use this. And this should bring you to some menu that lets you choose what kind of graph you want to make. So for most of the labs that you need to make a graph for this semester, the most useful kind of plot is going to be a scatter plot. So we're going to go ahead and click on scatter, and then that's going to give us the option of several different kinds of scatter plot. The main difference between these is that this first one just has the data marked as points, where these other ones have the data points connected by lines. We're going to add our own line in a little bit different way later on. So for now we're going to choose this one that doesn't have lines, this marked scatter plot. So if we click on that, it gives us an empty graph that doesn't have any data in it yet. So we have to tell Excel what data we want to be plotted in this graph. So I'm going to come into my graph and right click in here and then choose select data to let us tell it what data it needs. So we need to create a new data series in our graph. So we're going to come over here to this box that says series and click add, and this will make a new series. So we can call it whatever we want. I'll call it example data. And then we have to tell it specifically what variables it should plot on the x-axis and the y-axis. So for this graph, I want time on the x-axis and temperature on the y-axis. So in this box for x values, I'm going to come and click this little button right next to the box. That'll bring me back to my spreadsheet, and then I'm just going to click and drag across the data that I want to be on the x-axis and then hit enter. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the y-axis and hit enter again and click OK. And now we have our graph of our data. Pretty much everything on this graph you can modify to make it look just the way you like. So if you want to change the title of your graph, you can just click up here and type in whatever title you want. If you don't like this key, you can just click on it and delete it and it'll go away. If you want to change the scale on your axes, you can just right click on one of your axes, choose format axis, and you can put in whatever scale you want. So if I want it to start at 20 instead of 0, I can just change that 0 to a 20. You can change whether there are lines and how it shows the lines and stuff. Pretty much anything in this graph that you want to change, you can. If you want to change the way the data points look, We can just right click on one of these and choose Format Data Series, and we can change the color of them if we want them to be black instead of blue. And if we choose these marker style, we can decide what shape we want them to be. So I can make them triangles, and I can make them a little bit bigger. So anything you want to change to make your graph look the way you want it to look is pretty straightforward. So it looks like all of this data that I made up kind of falls along a straight line. So what we can do is do something called a linear regression to find out what the equation for this line is and have it add the line right onto the plot. So to do that, all we need to do is right click on one of our data points and click Add Trend Line. And this will give us a screen that has a lot of options for different regression types. So what it's doing with all of these is trying to come up with some equation that will describe where all of the data points on your graph are. So you can try to make them all fit on a line, do linear regression, or you can do all of these other various functions. You can do a logarithmic regression or a polynomial. And all of these are useful in different cases, but if you don't know which one you need, then generally linear regression is a good place to start. So we're going to choose linear, and we're going to go over here to look at some of the options. So like I say, what it's doing when it does this regression is trying to find an equation for a line that will come as close as possible to as many of your data points as it can. So if we want to know what the equation of the line is, we have to make sure we turn on this option for it to display the equation on the chart. And like I say, if you have a different version of Excel, this might not be in quite the same place. You might have to search around a little bit, but make sure you do turn on this option to display the equation on the chart. And then we can press OK, and we can see that it added this line that comes as close as you can get to all of our data points. Because this is experimental data, or it will be, in this case I just made it up, but generally when you're making your graph it will be experimental data. So you'll notice the data points don't all perfectly fall on the line. This is just a line that comes as close as possible to as many of the data points as possible. So it's added this line, and again, if we want to, we can right click on this line and format the line. We can change the color and things like that. But it's also added this equation to tell us exactly what the equation of the line is. So that's how you plot data in Excel, how you add a trend line. So one more thing we can do now that we have this graph, let's say we repeated this experiment, we can just come back here and add more data into our spreadsheet and add a second data series to the line. So I'm just going to make up new data. And then if we again right click on our graph and click select data, we can now add a second data series, call it whatever we want, and do the same thing to choose our X values. Choose our X values and choose our Y values. And so now we have a second set of data plotted on the same graph. And if we want to, again, we can come in here, add a trend line the same way we did for our first set of data. So this is the basics of how you make a graph in Excel. I think this is everything that you'll need to know for your post lab for week 5. But just to make it a little bit more clear, I'm going to go through the example and make a graph just like the one that was in the the week 5 lab handout. So if you remember, that handout has this example of a graph of bologna sandwiches. So I've already entered in here all the data that I used to make that graph. So if we do the same thing again, we can make a graph of this data, and it should look something like that. Now the graph that I have in the handout has the best fit lines already added, but if you notice, it has 2 different lines, and the graph that you're going to make from your experimental data should have 2 different lines, not just 1 line. So to do that, we have to kind of trick Excel a little bit, and even though this is really all one set of data, we have to treat it as 2 different data series. So I'm going to click on my graph and go into my select data, and I'm just going to get rid of everything that's here and add a new data series. And again, do the same thing to select the X values. So what we want is just these first 2 points that are going up from 10 to 20 to be one data series, and then the other points to be a separate data series. So I'm going to select my X values for just the first data series and my Y values. Then I'm going to add a second data series and do the same thing again with my other data points. So now I've added all of my data for the bologna sandwiches example, but I have 2 different data series, so that's going to allow me to make 2 different lines, one that's going up like this and another one that's going up like this. So to make my lines, you do the same thing again, just right click on your data and add a trend line. Now again, we want to display the equation on the chart. But now the other thing that we want to do is not make the lines top right at the end of the data. So in the bologna sandwiches graph in the handout, we can actually see our 2 lines intersecting. So we want this line to extend a little bit beyond the last data point. So to do that, we need to use this forecast option and tell it to forecast forward. So we change this 0 to a 1. That will make the line stretch much farther. Now this line was stretching too far, so probably instead of 1, we want it to forecast like 0.1 periods. And that looks pretty good. So we'll click OK. And then we'll add another trend line to the other data series the same way. And again, forecast this time backwards so that we can make the 2 lines intersect. Make sure we display the equation on the chart. So now we have our data entered in as 2 different data series, and we've added that forecast to the line so that we can see exactly where they intersect. So now I think the only difference between this graph and the one in your handout is the little details of the color and the size and the shape of the markers, but I already showed you how to change all of that. So now we have these equations for our best fit lines. So if we want to find out exactly where they intersect, all we have to do is set them equal to each other and solve for x, and that will give you the x value where the 2 lines intersect. And that intersection is what you need for your week 5 data analysis to find out the right ratio of starting materials. So I think this was all the information that you need to make the graph that you'll need to have for week 5. If you have any questions, please go to Tutoring Center to talk to the TAs, or you can email your preceptor, or you can post a question on Piazza. There are lots of ways to get your questions answered if you have any issues with that. So thank you for watching, and I hope this was helpful.